Chapter 8, Key Issue 3 and 4. This part of Key Issue 3 will continue from yesterday's Key Issue 2. The content objective, explain reasons why states are targeted by terrorism. Your ICANN statements, explain the concept of terrorism, describe distinct characteristics of international and domestic terrorism. 3. Describe ways that states have sponsored terrorism. And 4. Analyze the motives and threats of various state-sponsored terrorist organizations. Terrorism is defined by your textbook as systematic use of violence to intimidate a population or coerce a government. Distinct characteristics include, but not exclusive to, the following: the use of terroristic tactics such as bombing, kidnapping, hijacking, hostages, and assassinations. They view violence as a means of bringing widespread publicity, so getting it to the mass audience. And and they believe so strongly that they're willing to die for their cause. And then international terrorism is usually from developing countries, and targets are in developed countries. In modern day terrorism is different than historical terrorism. Were first documented in the storming of the Bastille in the French Revolution, where they targeted aristocrats or powerful rulers. They now target ordinary people rather than political figures or military figures. All right, 9/11 attacks, the most dramatic terrorist attacks against the United States in September 11, 2001. The tallest buildings of the U.S., the 110-story Twin Towers in the World Trade Center in New York City, were destroyed, as well as the Pentagon near Washington, D.C. was damaged. In the total mass of casualties, it is estimated that 2,000 plus had 2,977 civilian fatalities. And in addition, the 19 terrorists died on the 4 hijacked airplanes, and the responsible network was Al-Qaeda. Here we can see terrorist attacks against the U.S. Some of the terrorist attacks we see are terrorist organizations targeted by like Al-Qaeda or other operative groups that target Western civilizations, like Boko Haram, and again, Al-Qaeda was harbored by the Taliban in Afghanistan. But we can also see some domestic terrorism that we see with Orlando of 2016, with the gunman killed 49 people, injured 58. We're not sure. It was a nightclub in Orlando. The suspect was Omar Mateen. He was a U.S.-born citizen. But the FBI was unsure of his motives, whether it was he was working for a terrorist organization or he was targeting the LGBTQ community. Another more recent attack was in 2018. A gunman killed 11 and injured 6 at a Tree and a Life synagogue in Pittsburgh, and it was an anti-Semitic motive, so an anti-Jewish motive for the killings. And again, there's not enough information documented whether it was terrorist sponsored or not. All right, state-sponsored terrorism. When we look at organizations that sponsor terrorism, most are found in Middle East or Southwestern Asian countries. They recently, although there's additional countries, as noted below, they historically have provided a safe haven or a sanction, such as Afghanistan and most likely the Waristan region of Pakistan, where they've provided sanction for Al-Qaeda terrorists, where they've supplied weapons, money, and intelligence. They've also helped coordinate attacks. The countries where we see terrorism most prevalent today are in Afghanistan, Iraq, Syria, Pakistan, and Nigeria. Here's the compound of harboring Osama bin Laden in Pakistan, which is killed by Navy SEALs. Again, Osama bin Laden, he was from a wealthy family of Saudi Arabia. However, his father was born in Yemen. So what he really was, he was dispelled from Saudi Arabia, where he fled eventually to Afghanistan. while in Afghanistan, he formulated a coalition with the Taliban that's motive was to target Western civilizations, specifically the United States and other countries that supported Saudi Arabian government and the state of Israel. And they declared a religious war called a fatwa. So it was a calling for Muslims and their duty to wage war, a holy war against the U.S. and its citizens of the U.S. For again supporting the royal family of Saudi Arabia and the state of Israel. Al-Qaeda is known as the base or the foundation in Arabic. It is a decentralized terrorist organization, so it has cells. It's not one central location. It's been implicit in several bombings, with the first attack in the United States in 2001. Again, they're normal citizens that conduct themselves in ordinary society. They are very complex in how they organize, with having finance departments, media, legal, religious policies, and military committees in a council called the Majlis Shura. We can see the cells located throughout the United States, as well as Africa and parts of Southwest Asia and South Asia and parts of Europe. One of the more recent attacks of Al-Qaeda was in 2015 in the Paris offices, where they attacked a satirical newspaper, the Charlie Hebdo paper, where they depicted political cartoon with Muhammad's image, which is a taboo in the 5 Pillars of Islam. And in that, there were 11 people that were killed. Take a quick moment to reflect on what you learned. All right, ISIS or ISIL. ISIS is fighting for an independent, sovereign country. Was affiliated with Al-Qaeda at one point, recently defected, and now they're seen as a Sunni Muslim strict religious group that follows Sharia law, so strict law. They want to maintain control of territory, and maintaining control of the territory of what is Iraq and Syria would enforce human rights or enforce human control by maintaining control of the territory through violence and beheadings and massacres and tortures. Most of their recruiting has been through the social media with these heinous killings. And their control of regions of Iraq and Syria have diminished to about from 40% in 2014 to about 2% in 2018. Boko Haram is Arabic for meaning Western education is forbidden. So Boko Haram opposes the adoption of Western cultural practices, especially by Christians in the south of their country, where they're responsible for killing over 20,000 Nigerians and displacing 2.6 million. All right, to learn more about ISIS. Again, there's the territory loss of ISIS down to 2% in 2018. Terrorist sponsors. We see sponsoring terrorism in Iraq and Iran. They're accused of providing material and financial support. With Iraq and the accusation of harboring weapons of mass destruction was found by the United Nations with Saddam Hussein in Iraq, who had close links to Al-Qaeda. And then Iran has been accused by the U.S. of harboring Al-Qaeda members, trying to influence the civil war in Iraq. Then also, it is known to have involvement with other countries like Hezbollah in northern Israel or in the Golan Heights. All right, here's where we see nuclear energy. Again, remember with our last notes, Iran did not sign the non-proliferation plan of nuclear energy or nuclear power in 1970. The number of terrorist attacks have increased, especially in Iraq, Afghanistan, and Nigeria, since 2014 to 16. In the rest of the world, that's declined. All right, so we have a changing world. We have a world that has disagreement in government policies, as we saw with types of governments and systems of governments. We have disavowed terrorism. People that vast majority don't agree with terrorist sponsors or terrorism. Distinguish between peaceful and unfamiliar tactics in promoting terrorism. Balancing the policies of a growing 1.9 million Muslims and the abuse of Islam by Islamic terrorists. All right, again, quickly review what we've covered. And we'll move on to, again, this is just more, this we're going to skip, we didn't cover that. This is just more on terrorism. Again, if you want to look at the frontline video, you can take a look and answer the following questions. All right, moving on to key issue 4. Explain how boundaries cause problems. ICANN Statement 1, describe the types of physical boundaries between states. 2, describe the types of cultural boundaries between states. 3, describe 5 shapes of states and give examples of states currently. 4th, explain and identify states in the world that use both or either physical or cultural boundaries to define territories. And lastly, explain other forms of boundaries such as relic, consequent, superimposed, and antecedent boundaries. All right, for key issue 2, we're not going to complete this exercise. But traditionally, when we talk about boundaries, a boundary is a invisible line that marks the extent of a state's territory. Historically, frontiers rather than boundaries separated states. A frontier is a zone where no state exercises complete political control. Oftentimes, these are uninhabited or sparsely settled areas. However, frontiers have declined in the modern world because of advanced communication and territorial expansion. Advanced communication permits countries to monitor and guard boundaries effectively, even when they're not contiguous with a country. Types of boundaries we see are physical boundaries. So when we look at physical boundaries, we're talking about physical features of Earth that are significant to breaking or dividing two states or two areas of land. These were common in metes and bounds boundaries of Europeans, where they used physical boundaries to separate states. We can see, again, this is common in Europe with many boundaries. It's common in desert regions as well, because in physical boundaries, they can effectively divide two states because deserts are hard to cross and sparsely inhabited. Desert boundaries are common in Africa and Asia, North Africa and the Saharan Desert. Here are some examples of physical boundaries. Mountains, lakes. All right, so we can see in Europe the metes and bounds boundaries using physical boundaries such as the Danube River, dividing states as the Danube falls down, dividing states. And also the Rhine. There's the Danube. And then you have the Rhine River dividing states as well. Then down here you'd have the Pyrenees Mountains dividing Spain from France. And the Alps dividing Austria and Switzerland. So common metes and bounds, physical boundaries in Europe. Other types of boundaries are mountain boundaries. They effectively divide two states because of intervening obstacles, the mountains. And the mountains are permanent. Mountain boundaries are found in between Argentina and Chile. That divides along the crest of the Andes Mountains. But it also creates a dispute over boundaries. Where is the crest? Is it at the jag line? Is it at the mountain peak? Or is that at what mountain peak do they agree on? So it can be disputed. Water boundaries are another boundary. Those are rivers, lakes, and oceans. Those are less permanent than mountains because water levels tend to change in elevation as well as integrity of soil and ground. Water boundaries are reasonably visible on maps. Historically, water boundaries offered good protection against attacks from other states, but now that is not. They're not as strategic in warding off attack. Water boundaries are common in East Africa, especially the boundaries of the Democratic Republic of Congo and Uganda and Lake Albert. Boundaries separate Kenya, Tanzania, and Uganda with Lake Victoria. And the boundary also separates Burundi, Democratic Republic of Congo, Tanzania, and Zambia through Lake Tanganyika. Here shows the lake in Malawi, the boundary between Malawi and Mozambique. It runs through Lake Nyasa, which is known as Lake Malawi. Okay. Quickly review what we've learned. Geometric boundaries are cultural boundaries. Cultural boundaries, there are three types of, when we talk about cultural boundaries, one, we're talking about cultural boundaries, we're talking about ethnic boundaries, religious boundaries, language boundaries. Cultural boundaries can be geometric. Those are drawn by an invisible line or a geometric line. And those geometric lines are common like in the US and Canada, where we have the 49th parallel. However, there are areas of the United States that in the Northeast, such as New York and Vermont, that the border is along the 45 degree north parallel. So it can create disputes. So really what we're looking at with geometric boundaries is agreed upon 49th degree parallel, then also with subject to understanding that parallel can change to 45th north parallel in the Northeast, and also can change between Alaska and the Yukon Territory to 141 west longitude. And then also a boundary in the U.S. would be a physical boundary, Lake of the Woods. Ethnic boundaries. Ethnic boundaries, boundaries that divide ethnicities. Ethnic boundaries are found within nation states of England in the 19th century, so nation state building. Ethnic boundaries that we see today, the ethnic boundary of Indians and Pakistani we already talked about, that also fell along religious boundary lines between Hindus and Muslims. Ireland is another location in Northern Ireland of the United Kingdom. Roman Catholics comprise 84% of the population. So again, it's a cultural boundary that ties into religion. Only 41% of the 6 counties in Northern Ireland are Roman Catholics. So the majority of residents in Northern Ireland are Protestant, thus creating a religious or geometric boundary of Northern Ireland and the rest of Ireland. Let's talk about more ethnic boundaries. Let's see, do we have ethnic boundaries? Again, these are from nation states. Okay, cultural boundaries. Here's a picture of Cyprus. So Cyprus is the third largest island in the Mediterranean. It's composed of 2 ethnicities, Greek and Turks. Turks comprise 24% of the country's population, while Greeks comprise 63%. Cyprus was independent in 1960. When they were independent, they gave the Turkish minority a substantial share of elected offices and rights to education, religious, and cultural services. But Cyprus never peacefully integrated. Greece seized control of the government in 1974. Turkish armies remained on Cyprus, the northern 36% of the island controlled by Turkey. Only Turkey recognizes it as a separate state, the northern part of the Turkish residents. They've had a buffer zone. They've had a wall built, as we can see right here, On the blue, a wall's been built and it's been patrolled by the United Nations. The northern part, again, is Turkish. The southern is Greek. And more recently, they've moved to demolish some of the wall. And they were also inducted into the European Union in 2004, which brings future optimism for uniting the Turkish and Greeks with this cultural boundary of those two ethnicities in the island of Cyprus. There's also the Strait of Azov. The Strait of Azov was going back to, it's a geometric boundary. And this geometric boundary was boundaries between Algeria, Libya, and Egypt, and Mali, Nigeria, Chad, and Sudan. But later it became Chad and Libya, a straight line that was drawn across the desert by the French and British to separate the French colonies in Africa from British colonies. When Libya was an independent country, it claimed this straight line as their own in the territory known as the Azov Strip. Libya seized the Azov Strip in 1973, but the international courts ruled Chad's claim in 1994. So right now, the strip, Azov Strip, is still an area of conflict between Libya and Chad. However, the international court justice and international courts ruled it as an independent country, or as a country with sole right to the Azov Strip. Ireland, I already mentioned. All right, antecedent boundaries drawn before, typically of past explorers or occupiers. Subsequent, those are developed after a cultural boundary, so a religious boundary followed by a geometric boundary, as you can see with India and Pakistan, or Virginia and West Virginia. Superimposed, those are colonizer boundaries. Superimposed by Great Britain or French, as we can see mostly in sub-Saharan Africa. Relic boundaries existed from a previous point in time, such as the Great Wall of China and the Berlin Wall, and now we see with the wall in Cyprus. All right, quickly review. All right, and here's an application. Here's another application. All right, size and shapes.